Well, thank you very much indeed, John, for that very generous introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back here with you again this year for what, as John said, I think is my third year filling this slot at the end of the day. As ever with this conference, it's great to see some familiar faces and to have made some new connections here today. And as I'm the last speaker, I wanted to also say thank you to Ian and James and the ISJ and for putting on an excellent conference as usual, and to John as ever for being such an energetic and engaging chair. Yes, my name is Matthew Burnard, and I'm a principal at Control Risks based here in Dubai, and I lead our political and security risk analysis team for the MENA region. For those of you who are not familiar with us, Control Risks is an independent specialist risk consultancy. We have a long-standing presence in the Middle East, including a rapidly growing full-service office in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and about 50 offices around the world. And we work with our clients on everything from intelligence and risk analysis to crisis management and security risk consulting to investigations, business intelligence, and forensics to cybersecurity. Well, that's enough about control risks. Now, as the title of my presentation suggests, I'm gonna talk mainly about the security risk environment in the Middle East. But before I do that, I thought I would give you a quick update on how we at Control Risks are seeing the latest developments in India and Pakistan. So, as you'll all have seen, India overnight carried out what it called intelligence-based and precision airstrikes on 9 locations across Pakistan's Punjab province and Pakistani-administered Kashmir that it claimed housed terrorist organizations that were involved in the terrorist attack in Pahalgam in India on the 22nd of April. Pakistan claims to have downed a number of Indian jets and to have destroyed some Indian army posts across the other side of the border, although India disputes this. And it's not clear at this time. And India alleges that the Pakistani government was involved in or supported the attack, which the Pakistani government denies. And so these airstrikes overnight are the latest and most significant flashpoint in what has been escalating tensions between India and Pakistan since the 22nd of April attack. And so it seems like further military confrontation is probable in the coming days, and we're already seeing intensified skirmishes along the line of control, the de facto border between separating Indian and Pakistani-controlled Kashmir. And quite a bit of disruption. Various airports in northern India have been closed, and in Pakistan, Lahore and Islamabad airports have been closed and flights diverted to Karachi. That's the latest information I have as of an hour or two ago. So I think businesses operating in India and Pakistan should definitely prepare for disruption, airspace closures, disruption to shipping and trade routes along India's western coastline and Pakistan's eastern border. And I think we need to kind of strap ourselves in for some escalating rhetoric and kind of aggressive posturing, military drills, etc., which in themselves could cause some disruption from both sides over the coming days. But for now, as things stand, our assessment is that both sides will be intent on avoiding full-blown military confrontation, and certainly anything that impacts on major urban centers in either country. And accordingly, as of kind of this moment today, we at Control Risks have not changed our advice to clients operating in India or Pakistan outside of that kind of very localized border area along the line of control where you would probably want to think about evacuating sort of non-essential personnel, as a temporary precaution if you have operations there, I think. There's really nothing to gain for either side in escalating this further. The nuclear issue acts as a kind of very obvious deterrent, of course. And so while, as I said, I think we have to strap ourselves in for some sort of bellicose rhetoric over the coming days, we expect that behind the scenes, both sides will be looking for an off-ramp to de-escalate. That assessment could change if there's an unprecedented further escalation, significant civilian casualties, for instance, and there's always a risk that type of thing can happen in these sort of high tension, high stakes situations. But that's our assessment as of now, and we're watching it closely. And do grab me afterwards if you have any specific questions. So with that, I will turn back to the Middle East, and it feels like an understatement to say that a lot has happened in the past 12 months. When we were all here, and I was giving a version of this presentation last year in April 2024, we were really sort of in the hot grip of the metastasizing conflict that was spreading across the region from Hamas's 7th of October 2023 attack on Israel. This time last year, Israel was about to launch its operations in Rafah, which would go on to be one of the most intense and destructive phases of the war, and negotiations for a ceasefire had just about started at this time last year, but they would drag on in fits and starts for another 8 months. We were seeing near daily Israeli airstrikes on southern Lebanon and Beirut, and Hezbollah rocket, drone, and missile attacks on northern Israel, which intensified over the course of last summer and sort of culminated in the Israeli ground invasion into southern Lebanon on the 1st of October. During last summer, we were also seeing continued attacks by Iran-backed armed groups on US bases in Iraq and Syria, as well as on Israel, and we were seeing the Houthis expand the range and intensity of their attacks against vessels in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. We were, this time last year, in the midst of an unprecedented cycle of escalation between Israel and Iran, which saw dramatic and worrying direct missile attacks on each other's territory in April and October last year. All of this was punctuated, of course, by a series of kind of high-profile assassinations and killings. Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran on the 31st of July. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut on the 27th of September. And then, of course, Hamas leader and architect of the 7th of October attacks, Yahya Sinwar, on the 16th of October. And then, not directly related to the core Israel-Hamas war and its kind of associated conflict, seemingly out of nowhere, we had the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria in December. So, yes, since we were all gathered here last year, it's been an intense and frenetic 12 months for security professionals and security leaders in the Middle East. And I'm sure you all feel that. I certainly feel that. It's been professionally rewarding in some senses because security has had to be at the top of CEOs' agendas, and hence the security function has often had a direct line to senior leadership and has had a seat at the top table. But it's also been kind of exhausting and draining. And speaking for myself, sometimes I've found it almost impossible to kind of keep up and actually get ahead of things rather than just reacting to the latest crisis or latest escalation. Where we are now, and I say this with some caution and with caveats, but where we are now, from a security perspective, in the Middle East feels slightly less intense and slightly less volatile. And that's reflected in our 2025 risk map of the Middle East, which you see on the screen behind me here, which many of you will be familiar with, which has some just slightly lighter colors and not quite as much dark red as this time last year. I think part of that is due to events and changing dynamics. Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire on the 15th of January, which subsequently collapsed in March, but still Hamas's severely diminished military capability makes it unlikely that we'll see a return to conflict at the level and intensity of before the ceasefire. The Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire agreement that went into force in November last year, it's difficult to say it's holding because Israel still continues to carry out almost daily airstrikes on southern Lebanon and occasionally Beirut, but it has at least succeeded in taking some of the intensity and the escalatory potential out of the conflict, since Hezbollah is seeking to avoid a return to full-scale conflict and is not significantly responding. Iran-backed groups in Iraq have stepped down their attacks on Israel and US forces in Iraq, largely because of the diminished influence of Iran and Iran's ally Hezbollah and the fall of the Assad regime. And the US and Iran, for now, are seemingly both committed to a negotiation process, which, while it's ongoing at least, seems to significantly lessen the possibility of some kind of US or Israeli, or both, strike on Iran and its nuclear facilities. And Syria has not imploded as many people feared it would, although, as I'll go on to talk about, there are some worrying cracks are beginning to show in Syria. And I think part of the reason why it maybe feels slightly less intense is that we've kind of also all gotten used to operating in this environment, this kind of new normal, or this new paradigm for the security environment in the Middle East, and we're sort of learning to live with things as they are. That's not to say everything's rosy, though. There are still some concerning dynamics and some potential flashpoints in the region's security landscape. So, following that scene setting for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to dive a bit deeper into what we at Control Risks think are some of the key issues and dynamics that will drive the security threat environment in the region over the next 12 months. So I'm going to touch on the US-Iran talks, the growing direct hostilities between the US and the Houthis in Yemen and the outlook for the Red Sea, where we see Syria going, and then I'll finish with some final reflections and observations that are on my mind and that we've been talking to our clients about. So first then, on the state of play between the US and Iran. Well, frankly, a couple of months ago, as President Trump was coming into office and following his threats to Iran and his quotes that there's going to be bombing, unquote, and things like that, and with the close political relationship between Trump and Netanyahu, who's long been pushing for a military solution, so to speak, to Iran's nuclear program, I personally felt like there was a good chance that at some point this summer, we'd all be waking up to news of multiple explosions and airstrikes across Iran. The sort of like military strike was happening. And at Control Risks, we regarded that possibility as credible enough that over the past few months, we spent time analyzing what a US and or Israeli strike on Iran could look like and gaming out the scenarios for the sort of range of potential Iranian responses and escalation pathways. fortunately, we seem to be moving away from that scenario. There have been 3 rounds of talks so far, with a 4th round possibly going to happen this weekend, depending on President Trump's travel schedule to the Middle East. And both sides are expressing a willingness to continue talking, and we're even hearing some sort of cautious optimism from both sides that a deal will be reached. And I think as long as talks continue, the likelihood of a US and or Israeli military strike on Iran is low. Is low. That being said, it's far from a done deal. The red lines on both sides appear to remain quite contradictory, which is likely to complicate the talks and prevent an agreement in the coming weeks and months. So, given this, we think the most likely scenario over the coming 6 to 12 months is that talks continue, maybe with some kind of stoppages and sort of brinkmanship here and there. The talks continue, but without making any real tangible progress or a breakthrough, putting us in essentially a continuation of the status quo, meaning that I think we'll see the continuation of the intensification of the Trump administration's maximum pressure 2.0 policy on Iran, so more sanctions, more enforcement, more aggressive enforcement of existing sanctions, more designations and listings, really trying to ratchet up the pain on the Iranian economy. We'll see continued tit-for-tat sort of attacks between Iran-backed groups, the Houthis, Hamas, of course, and Israel. I think we'll see Iran responding probably by increasing its seizures and harassments of vessels in the Gulf. And I think we'll see Iran continuing with its nuclear enrichment and activities, while at the same time sort of, kind of also indicating a willingness to scale that back in return for the kind of deal that they want. So, while I think that we'll avoid this US and or Israeli strike on Iran scenario, it seems like tensions will remain at a sort of elevated level. The alternative scenario would be that we get a deal, most likely some kind of interim deal in which Iran scales back nuclear enrichment levels and grants some access to IAEA inspectors in return for US sanctions relief and the unfreezing of Iranian assets abroad. But as I said, I think the two sides are unfortunately too far apart currently to make that a realistic prospect over the coming months. So we think that this kind of tense status quo, but without escalating to the US-Iran military strike option, is the most likely scenario. Where things do seem to be escalating beyond the current level, where things do seem to be going sort of in the wrong direction, is with the Houthis in Yemen and the Red Sea, where in recent weeks we've seen a sustained and wide-ranging US strikes on the Houthis, considerably broader and more intense than the previous operation under the Biden administration, and also retaliatory Houthi attacks on US naval and air forces, as well as attacks against Israel. And then, of course, there have been the Israeli airstrikes on the port of Hodeidah on Monday and on Sana'a airport yesterday. Now, President Trump kind of popped up yesterday and said he's calling off the US airstrikes with immediate effect. Neither President Trump nor his administration have provided much further detail as far as I've seen so far. So it's a bit unclear how this came about and what the agreement between the US and the Houthis, if there is one, encompasses. It looks like it may have been mediated by Oman. But regardless of the terms of the agreement and whether it holds, I think a premise that we have to recognize here is that the Houthis are a durable political and military force in Yemen and the region. They're not going anywhere, I don't think, to put it simply. So if the aim of the broadened attacks against the Houthis since March was to achieve the group's kind of decisive neutralization, and if Israel has any designs on trying to achieve that, then I guess I would question whether that's a realistic or a feasible objective or prospect. And although the recent US campaign since March has inflicted some military and economic damage on the Houthis, the Houthis have also demonstrated an ability to effectively adjust their planning and their tactics in response to strike patterns, and will very likely retain some capabilities to threaten merchant traffic in the southern Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, even though they haven't done that since December. The US Navy, and also to conduct further attacks on Israel. So not only does any military campaign have, I think, limited prospects to strike a sort of definitive blow against the Houthis, at the same time, I think pushing the military options further could also risk an escalation. So for instance, if the US or Israel succeeds in killing senior Houthi leaders, or if we see a US-supported major ground offensive in Yemen by anti-Houthi groups against the Houthis, which has been kind of rumored and speculated about in recent weeks, then I think it's possible that the Houthis escalate by attempting to completely shut down the Bab al-Mandab Strait, and that would be ugly, and so that would include things like the Houthis deploying waves of fast patrol boats to indiscriminately attack and harass commercial vessels, possibly the placing or claims to have placed floating sea mines en masse in the Bab al-Mandab and southern Red Sea, which would pose an indiscriminate risk to all vessels. And this would cause massive disruption, and there'd be a prolonged period required to clear the mines. Most war risk insurers would probably lose appetite for underwriting vessels. And that's not to mention the likelihood of further Houthi attacks against Israel. The most recent Houthi missile attack against Israel on the 4th of May, targeting Ben Gurion International Airport in Tel Aviv, saw a missile cause a 25-meter deep crater just 75 meters from the airport's Terminal 3, causing operations to temporarily be disrupted and some carriers to suspend flights, which shows you that the Houthis can cause real trouble for Israel. So all that's to say, the situation with the Houthis in Yemen and the Red Sea is kind of something of a tinderbox with a lot of potentially negative outcomes, which is why we're watching it closely. Another country we're watching closely is Syria. So since the fall of the Assad regime and the emergence of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS-led government, over the past few weeks, we at Control Risk, of the past few months, we at Control Risks have had a steady stream of inquiries from companies and organizations that are looking to sort of maybe return to or re-enter Syria, asking about how we can support them. So there is interest in Syria as a new or returning market in the region. And some of the companies that you in the audience all represent may well sort of be looking at Syria, have Syria on the agenda for this year. And I think the initial signs have been quite good. President Ahmed al-Sharaa appears to have been trying to take quite a pragmatic approach by moving quickly to sign a temporary constitution and set out the parameters and approximate time frame of a transitional period. He included some technocrats and representatives of minority groups in his cabinet recently to project an image of inclusiveness and reform. So he's also been quite pragmatic in engaging with other regional countries, including Iraq and the Gulf countries, and in quite definitively saying that he doesn't want to have any conflict with Israel. But so with that being said, this new embryonic Syrian state rests on quite fragile foundations, and we've seen some quite worrying cracks beginning to show in recent weeks. You'll all have seen kind of numerous reports of worsening sectarian violence and clashes, which sort of indicate the government's weak control over various armed groups and factions. There've also been growing calls from various different ethnic and minority groups for self-determination beyond just the Kurds. And there've been a series of Israeli airstrikes and ground incursions, which are at least partially trying to stop Turkey getting too much of a foothold in Syria, which kind of complicates the security environment. And there's still a fractured governance and security environment in northern border regions where security is controlled by a variety of different armed groups. But I think perhaps even more than the security environment, what's going to put the brakes on international companies seriously engaging with Syria is sanctions. The US Treasury did in January issue what it calls a general license, allowing limited energy-related transactions and personal remittances to Syria. However, a comprehensive and strict sanctions regime that sort of targets thousands of individuals and entities linked to the former Assad regime in Syria. Not to mention HTS itself, which remains designated as a terrorist organization by the US, remains in place. The EU has also signaled its intention to gradually ease sanctions, and I note that Shara is on a visit to France this week, and I think, in fact, due to meet President Macron as we speak today. But progress on the EU rolling back sanctions on Syria is conditional on inclusive governance and the well-being of minorities, which, based on the evidence of the last few weeks, evidently still needs a lot of work and could be a slow road. And overall, lifting sanctions is just very politically challenging and an administratively arduous process. So overall, I think don't want to be negative, but I think despite the sort of initial rush of enthusiasm, a combination of the question mark over the security environment and the sanctions issue is going to make Syria quite a tricky proposition still for most international companies this year, I think. So so those are some of the key issues and dynamics in the regional security landscape that we at Control Risks are thinking about and talking with our clients about. So I hope that was useful. I'm aware there are some big and consequential countries that I didn't get to go into detail on. Iraq, Egypt, Libya, in fact, any of North Africa. So please do feel free to grab me afterwards, or take my card, and I'll be happy to have a follow-up discussion. It's a very challenging environment, but I think the good news is that we as security leaders, using the many of the approaches and tools that I've heard discussed in the sessions today, can add real value to the organizations that we serve in navigating the security environment in the region. So with that, I will finish and hand back to you. Thank you very much, Sean.